Good afternoon, class. Welcome back to our analytical geometry subject. Okay, so for this week, we are now on our week 9 of our discussion for this subject. And this week, we will discuss about hyperbola. Okay, so what is hyperbola? So when discussing this topic for today about hyperbola, we are going to discuss on how to or learn on how to locate a hyperbola's vertices and foci, and also we are going to learn on how to write equations of hyperbolas in standard form and graph hyperbolas centered and not centered at the origin. Okay. All right. So I have here a question about our topic. Yeah. What do paths of comets, supersonic booms, ancient Grecian pillars, and natural draft cooling towers have in common? Okay, so ano yung, what do they have in common? So they can all be modeled by the same type of conic. Okay, so for example, when something moves faster than the speed of sound, a shock wave in the form of a cone is created. Okay? So a portion of a conic is formed when the wave intersects the ground, resulting in a sonic boom. Okay? So there. And so wave created from shock wave, okay, that is the portion and the portion of a hyperbola. So a shock wave intersecting the ground forms a portion of a conic and results in a sonic boom. All right. And so most people are familiar with sonic boom created by aircraft, but humans were breaking the sound barrier long before the first supersonic flight. Okay, so the crack of a whip occurs because the tip is exceeding the speed of sound. The bullets shot from many firearms also break the sound barrier, although the bang of the gun usually supersedes the sound of the sonic boom. Okay? Ayun. Now, as we go further to our discussion, so hyperbola is a conic section formed by intersecting a right circular cone with a plane at an angle, such that both halves of the cone are intersected. Okay, such that both halves of the cone are intersected, right? And this intersection produces two separate unbounded curves that are mirror images or images of each other. Okay, kagaya ng figure natin dito sa side na ito. Alright, so like ellipses, kagaya ng ng ellipse, okay, hyperbola can also be defined. Alright, so this hyperbola can also be defined as a set of points, okay? So set of points in the coordinate plane, okay? A hyperbola is the set of all points, okay? Set of all points, yung points natin, yung dalawang coordinate na yan, in a plane such that the difference of the distances between x and y and the foci is a positive constant. Okay? Ayun. Yan. So, a hyperbola is the set of all points, yan yung x, y, sa plane, coordinate plane, such that the difference of the distances between this point and the foci is a positive constant. Okay? So, notice that the definition of a hyperbola is very similar to that of an ellipse. So the distinction is that the hyperbola is defined in terms of the difference of two distances. Okay? Ayun. Two distances. Whereas the ellipse is defined in terms of the sum of two distances. Okay? So, si hyperbola, difference, okay? Difference of two distances. Yung si ellipse, sum of two distances. Okay? So, can you get the difference between the ellipse and the hyperbola? So, we just discussed the ellipse last week. Alright? Ayun. Wait lang. Going back. So, as with okay, so ayan, so as with ayan, so sorry, as with the ellipse, every hyperbola has two axes of symmetry. Okay, so ayan. In locating the vertices and foci of a hyperbola, so kagaya rin ng ellipse, a hyperbola also has two axes of symmetry. Okay, so the first one is the transverse axis, which is a line segment that passes through the center of the hyperbola and has vertices as its end points. Okay, so ito, yan yung transverse niya, segment, okay? Transverse axis. Yan, line segment that passes through the center, all right? Center of the hyperbola, okay? And has vertices as its endpoints, all right? So the foci lie on the line that contains the transverse axis. Okay, so dito, so yung foci that lies on this line contains the transverse axis. So ito yung foci natin, tama? So this line, so dito naglalay yung foci that contains our transverse axis. Intindihan, ito yung line segment na yan. We call it as the transverse axis. And we have the conjugate axis, which is a perpendicular to the transverse axis. Ayan, so perpendicular siya dito sa transverse natin. And has two co-vertices. Ayan, it has two co-vertices as its endpoints. Okay, so ayan yung endpoints ni conjugate axis. Alright. And we have the center of a hyperbola, which is the midpoint. Ayan, the midpoint. So dito, the center of the hyperbola. Midpoint of both the transverse and the conjugate axis where they intersect. Alright? Ayan, intersect. Diba sabi natin kanina si conjugate, perpendicular siya kay transverse axis. So at the center of our hyperbola, we have the two axes, the conjugate and the transverse axis that intersect. Okay, so they intersect dito sa midpoint natin ng hyperbola. And every hyperbola has two asymptotes. Okay, so ano yung two asymptotes na yan that pass through its center? Okay, so looking at our diagram, ayan, so ito yung dalawa niyang asymptotes, passes through the center. Alright, so it passes through the center. Or its center, the center of the hyperbola. Ayan, so as a hyperbola recedes from the center, its branches approach this asymptotes. Alright, so kapag nag-recedes na yung hyperbola from the center, its branches approach the asymptotes. So, ayun. And we have the central rectangle of the hyperbola, which is centered, okay? So which is centered at the origin with sides that pass through each vertex and co-vertex. So it is a useful tool for graphing the hyperbola and its asymptotes. Alright? So yan yung central rectangle natin. Okay? So to sketch the asymptotes of the hyperbola, simply sketch and extend the diagonals of the central rectangle. Ayan. So para sketch lang natin, i-extend lang natin, okay? Extend lang natin yung diagonals ng central rectangle, okay? Ayan, just to sketch the asymptotes of the hyperbola. Okay, so in this section, in locating the vertices, we will limit our discussion to hyperbolas that are positioned vertically or horizontally in the coordinate plane. The axis will either lie on or be parallel to the x and y axis. So we will consider two cases. So ano yung two cases in here? Those that are centered at the origin and those that are centered at a point other than the origin or not centered. Okay, so we have the derivation of the equation or deriving the equation of a hyperbola centered at the origin. So we let this point, negative c and 0 and c and 0, c0 be the foci of a hyperbola centered at the origin. Okay, so the hyperbola is the set of all points. So yung set of all points na yan, yung x and y natin sa plane, such that the difference of the distances from x and y to the foci is constant. Alright? So, ganyan. Ganyan yung kalalabasan. So, if we let this point to be our foci. Okay, di ba sabi natin yung foci natin, it lies on the line on the line that contains the transverse axis, di ba? Sabi natin kanina, ito yung transverse axis natin with this endpoint. So yung endpoints ng transverse ito. Ayan. So we let these points to be the foci of our hyperbola centered at the origin. Okay? And the hyperbola is the set of all points such that the difference of the distances from this point to the foci is constant. All right, so if A0, if A0 is a vertex, sulat na lang natin, vertex of hyperbola, ayan. So if A0 is the vertex of hyperbola, so the distance from negative C0 to A0 is A minus negative C equals A plus C. Okay? And then the distance from C0 to A0 is C minus A. So the sum of the distances, ayan, so yung sum of the distances from, ayan, the sum yan ilang distances, okay, these distances from foci to the vertex is A plus C minus C minus A, which is equal to 2A. Okay? Right? And, tutuloy natin sa kabila. Tuloy dito. So, if this point is a point or point on the hyperbola, okay, we can define the following variables. So, ito yung variables. Distance from, so distance from negative C0 to xy. And then yung next na distance, distance from C0 to xy. Okay, so if xy, ayan, so if this point is the point on the hyperbola. Okay, so ito na yung definition ng dalawang distances. This distance is distance from this point to this point or to that point. All right. So by definition of a hyperbola, okay, so this distances is constant for any point xy on the hyperbola, right? So we know that the difference of these distances is 2a for the vertex A0. And it follows that d sub 2 minus d sub 1 is equal to 2a for any point on the hyperbola. As with the derivation of the equation of an ellipse, so begin by applying the distance formula, right? And the rest of the derivation is algebraic, all right? So compare. So paano yan? We can compare this derivation with the one from the previous section for ellipses. Okay? So paano? Oh, ito. Ayan. So, divide yung dalawang distances, yung difference. Okay. So, compare natin yung derivation natin dito sa ellipses na ginawa natin last time. So, x minus negative c squared plus, ito yung distance formula. Okay? Squared plus, ayan. So, x minus c squared plus y minus 0 squared. Okay, equals 2a. All right, and then simplify the expression. So if we are going to simplify, so this will be the quantity of x plus c squared plus y squared. Ayan, so square root yan ha. Plus the square root of, yan, the quantity of x minus c squared plus y squared equals 2a. Right? And then move radical to opposite side. So if we are going to move radicals to opposite side, so the result would be equals 2a plus, yeah, so x minus c squared plus y squared. Okay? Then after that, square both sides. So if we are going to square both sides, so the result is, since we squared na sila, so x plus c squared plus y squared, para matanggal yung radical sign, tama? So this is 2a plus x minus c squared plus y squared. Ayan. And then expand the squares. So wala na tayong space. Next slide na lang. So expand the squares. X squared plus 2cx plus c squared plus y squared equals 4a squared plus 4a, all right? Then the square root of the quantity of x minus c squared plus y squared, okay? Plus x minus c squared plus y squared, okay? And then expand the remaining squares. Since may remaining squares pa tayo, x squared plus 2cx plus c squared plus y squared equals 4a squared plus 4a, okay? So x minus c squared plus y squared plus, so expand lang natin ito. Alright, so x squared minus 2xc plus c squared plus y squared. Alright? And then, combine like terms. So, asan ba yung mga like terms dyan? Meron ba? O ito, see? So, if we are going to combine like terms, or yes, so ito yung result. So, 2cx is equal to 4a squared minus 4a square root of, okay, plus y squared minus 2cx, okay? And then isolate the radicals. So if we are going to isolate the radicals, this would be 4cx minus 4a squared equals 4a, the square root of, okay, the quantity of x minus c squared plus y squared. Then divide by 4. Ayan, so divide natin yan ng 4. This is equal to cx minus a squared equals a. Okay, so tanggal na tayo ng 4. X minus c squared plus y squared. Okay? And then square both sides. Ayan. So if we are going to square both sides, so ganyan yung mangyayari. Ayan. So square, magiging square na yun. Tapos, ayun, alright? Then expand the squares. So we are going to expand the squares. So this is equal to c square x square minus 2a squared cx plus a to the fourth power equals a squared times x squared minus 2cx plus c squared plus y squared. Okay? Then, distribute natin yung a squared. Okay? Since we distribute and combine like terms, ayan, so magiging a to the fourth power c squared x squared equals to a squared x squared plus a squared c squared plus a squared y squared. Right? And then combine. So after combining like terms, rearrange the terms. Ayan. So we are going to rearrange c squared x squared minus a squared x squared minus a squared y squared equals a squared c squared minus a squared. Okay? Then factor the common terms. Dito na lang. So if we're going to factor, magiging x squared times c squared minus a squared, tama? Minus a squared y squared equals a squared times c squared minus a squared. Okay? And then, yan. So after factoring, wait, kulang ko siya. So x squared d squared minus a squared y squared equals a squared b squared. Alright? So, dito, we set, okay, ayan, this is the equation na yan, we set b squared equals to c squared minus a squared. Okay, kaya ito yung result niya. And then, divide both sides by a squared and b squared. Okay? So, ito na yung result. X squared, b squared. We divide both sides by a squared, b squared. Alright? Minus x squared, y squared over a squared, b squared equals to a squared, b squared over a squared, b squared. Para lang maging 1 ito. Alright? And then, cancel na tayo. Wait lang, wala yung D. Ayun. So, this is now equal to x squared over a squared plus y squared over b squared. Okay? So, this equation defines a hyperbola centered at the origin with vertices. So, ano yung vertices? With vertices plus minus a0 and co-vertices. So, yung co-vertices niya, 0 plus minus b. Okay? Right. So, it defines hyperbola at centered at the origin with vertices plus minus 0, a0, co-vertices 0 plus minus. Alright? Now we have the standard forms of the equation of a hyperbola with center 0, 0. Okay? So, the standard form of the equation of a hyperbola with center 0, 0 and transverse axis on the x-axis is this equation wherein the length of the transverse axis is 2a. The coordinates of the vertices are positive plus minus a0. The length of the conjugate axis is 2b. The coordinates of the co-vertices are 0 plus and minus b. The distance between the foci is c squared equals to a squared plus b squared. And the coordinates of the foci are plus and minus c0. The equations of the asymptotes are y equals to plus and minus b over a x. Okay? And the standard form of the equation of a hyperbola with center 0, 0 and transverse axis on the y-axis is y squared over a squared minus x squared over b squared equals to 1, where the length of the transverse axis is 2a, the coordinates of the vertices are 0 plus and minus a, the length of the conjugate axis is 2b, the coordinates of the co-vertices are plus and minus b 0, the distance between the foci is c squared equals to a squared plus b squared. The coordinates of the foci are 0 plus and minus c. The equations of the asymptotes are y equals to plus and minus a over b x. Alright? So, note in here that, okay, ano na yun? Ayun. So, you have to note that the vertices, ayan, vertices, co-vertices, and foci are related by the equation c squared equals to a squared plus b squared. So these are related to these equations. So when we are given the equation of a hyperbola, we can use this relationship to identify its vertices and foci. Alright? Ayun. And ayan. So here are the horizontal hyperbola with ito, center 0, 0, and the vertical hyperbola with center 0, 0. Alright? Now we have given the equation of a hyperbola in standard form. Locate its vertices and foci. So, paano? How? First is to determine whether the transverse axis lies on the x or y axis. And notice that a squared is always under the variable with the positive coefficient. So if you set the other variable equal to 0, you can easily find the intercepts. So in this case, where the hyperbola is centered at the origin, the intercepts coincides with the vertices, right? If the equation has the form x squared over a squared minus y squared over b squared equals 1. Then the transverse axis lies on the x-axis. The vertices are located at plus and minus a 0 and the foci are located at plus and minus c 0. Ayun. And if the equation has the form y squared over a squared minus x squared over b squared equals 1, then the transverse axis lies on the y-axis. And the vertices are located at this point, and the foci are located at this point, 0 positive minus c. Okay? And second, solve for a using the equation a is equal to the square root of a squared. And for this number 3, solve for c using the equation c is equal to the square root of a squared plus b squared. Alright? Ayan. So, locating a hyperbola's vertices and foci, identify the vertices and foci of the hyperbola with equation y squared over 49 minus x squared over 32 equals to 1. Right? So, the equation has the form, ano yung form natin? The equation has the form y squared over a squared minus x squared over b squared equals 1. So, the transverse axis lies on, so yung transverse axis natin, it lies on the y-axis. Alright? So, the hyperbola is centered at the origin. The vertices serve as the y-intercepts of the graph. So, to find the vertices, so paano hahanapin yung vertices? We have to set x as 0 and solve for y. Okay? So, dito, so ito yung equation. Since we set x as 0, alright, so y squared over a squared minus 0 squared over b squared equals to 1. And then y squared over 49 equals to 1. Wait, this is 49 and 32. Tama? Ayan. Yung b square natin ay 32. So, this is now equal to y squared over 49 equals to 1. And then, yung y squared is equal to plus or minus the square root of 49. So, yung value ng y natin ay plus and minus 7. Okay? So, the foci are located at 0 plus and minus c. Okay, so solving for C is equal to the square root of A squared plus B squared. So this is equal to 49 plus 32. And this is equal to square root of 81, and that is 9. Okay? So, therefore, the vertices are located at 0 plus and minus 7, and foci are located at 0, 9. Okay, same value ni C ay 9. Perfect square kasi si 81. Yun. Now, in writing equations of hyperbolas in standard form, just as with ellipses, writing the equation for a hyperbola in standard form allows us to calculate the key features. So, ano ba yung mga key features? Its center, vertices, co-vertices, foci, asymptotes, and the lengths and positions of the transverse and conjugate axis. Okay? Ayun. So, conversely, an equation of a hyperbola can be found given its key features. So, by this, we begin by finding standard equations for hyperbola centered at the origin. Okay? Ayan. So, centered at the origin. Yan. So, we will turn our attention to finding standard equations for hyperbola centered at some point other than the origin. So, we have hyperbola centered at the origin. Reviewing the standard forms given for hyperbola centered at 0, 0, we see that the vertices, co-vertices, and foci are related by the equation C squared equals to A squared plus b squared. So note that this equation can also be written or rewritten as b squared equals to c squared minus a squared. So this relationship is used to write the equation for a hyperbola when given the coordinates of its foci and vertices. So, paano? Given the vertices and the foci of a hyperbola centered at 0, 0, write its equation in standard form. Alright, so how? First is determine whether the transverse axis lies on the x or y axis. If the given coordinates of the vertices are and foci have the form plus minus a0 and plus and minus c0 respectively. Then the transverse axis is the x-axis, so we have to use this standard form. X squared over a squared minus y squared over b squared equals to 1. And if the given coordinates of the vertices and foci have the form 0 plus and minus a and 0 plus and minus c respectively, then the transverse axis is the y-axis. So this is the standard form that we are going to use. Y squared over a squared minus x squared over b squared equals to 1. And then secondly, find b squared using the equation b squared equals to c squared minus a squared, and substitute the values for a squared and b squared into the standard form of the equation determined dito sa step 1. So ito yung mga standard form ng equation natin. Alright? After finding the b squared. So let's have an example. What is the standard form equation of the hyperbola that has vertices plus and minus 6, 0, and foci plus and minus 2 the square root of 10, 0. Alright? So, paano yan? The vertices and foci are on the x-axis. So, the equation for the hyperbola will have the form y squared over a squared minus x squared over b squared equals to 1. Since the foci and vertices are on the x-axis. So ano ba yung mga vertices natin? So yung vertices ay 6, 0, a is equal to 6, and so yung a squared natin is 36. Tama? And how about the foci? The foci are plus and minus 2 the square root of 10 and 0. So, c is equal to 2 the square root of 10. C squared is equal to 40. Alright? So, solving for b squared, we have c squared minus a squared. So, this is 40. Substitute lang natin yung c squared and a squared, this is 36. So, b squared is equal to 4. Okay, so yung nakuha na natin yung value ni b squared. And so, finally, we have to substitute a squared and b squared into the standard form na nandito. Kasi nahanap na natin yung value ni b squared. So, the equation of the hyperbola is equal to y squared over 36 minus x squared over 4 equals to 1. So, ito na yung equation ng hyperbola. Alright? And then, so ito na yung graph niya. Intindihan. So, it lies, the foci and the vertices are on the x-axis. Ayun. So, nasa x-axis yan. Now we have hyperbolas not centered at the origin. So, like the graphs for other equations, the graph of a hyperbola can be translated. If a hyperbola is translated, ayun, h units horizontally and k units vertically, the center of the hyperbola will be hk. So this translation results in the standard form of the equation that we saw previously lang. So with x replaced by x minus h. Diba? So magsawa kayo, ginagamit pa rin natin siya. And y replaced by y minus k. And the standard form of the equation of a hyperbola with center hk and transverse axis parallel to the x-axis, x-axis is this one. So, x minus h, the quantity squared over a squared minus y minus k, the quantity squared over b squared equals to 1, wherein the length of the transverse axis is 2a. The coordinates of the vertices are h plus and minus a k. The length of the conjugate axis is 2b. The coordinates of the vertices are h, k plus and minus b. The distance between the foci is c squared, wait, baka maguluhan kayo dyan. C squared equals to a squared plus b squared yan. Okay, and the coordinates of the foci are h plus and minus c, k. Alright? And the asymptotes of the hyperbola coincide with the diagonals of the rectangle. And the length of the rectangle is 2a and its width is 2b. Okay? The slopes of the diagonals are plus and minus b over a. And each diagonal passes through the center hk. So using this point or point slope formula, it is simple to show that the equations of the asymptotes are y equals to plus or minus b over a, such that x minus h plus x minus h plus k. All right. And the standard form of the equation of a hyperbola with center hk and transverse axis parallel to the y-axis is this form. Ayan. Where The length of the transverse axis is 2a. The coordinates of the vertices are h, k plus or minus a. The length of the conjugate axis is 2b. The coordinates of the co-vertices are h plus or minus bk. The distance between the foci is 2c, where c squared equals a squared plus b squared po yan, right? And the coordinates of the foci are h, k plus or minus c. Okay, so using this reasoning, the equations of the asymptotes are y equals to plus or minus a or b, a over b, and x minus h plus k. Alright? And ito na yung horizontal and vertical hyperbola with center hk. Alright? So, like hyperbolas centered at origin, hyperbolas centered at point hk. Okay? Have vertices, meron siyang vertices, co-vertices, and foci. Alright? So, nasan yung mga foci natin? Ito. That are related by the equation. So, they are related by the equation c squared equals to a squared plus b squared. So, we can use this relationship along with the midpoint and distance formulas to find the standard equation of a hyperbola when the vertices and foci are given. Alright? So, using this relationship. Now, paano? Given the vertices and foci of a hyperbola centered at hk, write its equation in standard form. So, how is that? First, determine whether the transverse axis is parallel to the x or y axis. If the y-coordinates of the given vertices and foci are the same, then the transverse axis is parallel to the x-axis. So, ito yung gagamitin nating standard form. Another one, if the x-coordinates of the given vertices and foci are the same, then the transverse axis is parallel to the y-axis, and we are going to use this standard form. Okay? And second, identify the center of the hyperbola, which is the point hk, center hk, using the midpoint formula and the given coordinates for the vertices. And another one, find a square by solving for the length of the transverse axis, which is 2a, which is the distance between the given vertices. Another one, find c squared using h and k found in step 2, ayun, along with the given coordinate for the foci. And 5, solve for the b squared using the equation b squared equals to c squared minus a squared. And lastly, substitute the values for h, k, a squared, and b squared into the standard form of the equation determined in step 1. Alright? So, paano yan? Let's have some example here. So, finding the equation of a hyperbola centered at hk given its foci and vertices. So, what is the standard form equation of the hyperbola that has vertices at 0, -2, and 6, -2, and foci at -2, -2, and 8, -2? So, ano yung standard form equation? So, the y-coordinate of the vertices and foci are the same. Tama ba? Yung y-coordinate. Ano yung pagkakapareho niya? -2. Oh. So, the transverse axis is parallel. Parallel to the x-axis. Okay? Since yung y-coordinates natin ay pare-pareho, ayan, -2 lahat yung y-coordinate. Kaya yung transverse axis natin, parallel siya sa x-axis. Di ba? Horizontal yung x-axis natin. Thus, the equation of the hyperbola will have this form. Ayan, so x minus h is squared over a squared minus y minus k quantity squared over b squared equals to 1. Ayan. So, first, we identify the center. Identify muna natin yung center ng HK. HK, the center is halfway between the vertices. Ayan, between the vertices 0, -2 and 6, -2. So, applying the midpoint formula, if we are going to apply the midpoint formula by finding HK or yung center, so 0 plus 6 over 2, -2 plus -2. Ayan, over 2. So, yung center natin ay 3, -2. Now, we have to find for a squared. Okay, so the length of the transverse axis is 2a, tama? Ayan, so 2a, which is bounded by the vertices. So we can find a squared. We can find a squared by finding the distance formula between the x coordinates and the vertices. So, ayan. So 2a is equal to 6. Ayan, so divide both by 2, a is equal to 3. Kaya yung a square natin ay 9. Tama? Ayan. Now, we need to, kaya yung a square natin ay equal to 9. And now, we need to find for c squared. And the coordinates for the foci, so ano yung mga coordinates natin sa foci? H plus minus C, K, tama? So, H negative C, K is equal to -2, 2. Yun. And then, H positive C, tapos K ay 8, -2. Okay. -2 yan. So, we can use the x-coordinate from either of these points to solve for C using point 8, -2 and substituting yan, H which is equal to 3. So, H plus C equals to 8. Alright. And then yung value ni H, so 3 plus C equals to 8. Kaya, ang C natin ay 5. Okay? C ay 5, and then C squared now is equal to 25. So, this is equal to 25. So, nakahanap na natin yung value ni C squared. So, kulang na natin yung space. So, dito na lang. So, next is, so, ano yung nakuha natin sa A? A squared is 9. May sulat natin dito. A squared is 9. C squared is 25. Alright? So, hanapin naman natin si B squared. So, we have to solve for B squared by using the equation B squared equals to C squared minus A squared. So, may value na tayo ng A squared and C squared. Substitute na lang natin yung value, 25 minus 9. So, B squared now is equal to 16. Kaya ang B squared is equal to 16. And so finally, substitute the values found for HK, A squared, and B squared doon sa standard form natin. So ano ulit yung standard form? So, i-rewrite lang natin para mas clear. Over A squared minus over B squared equals to 1. So, substitute lang natin yung mga values na nahanap natin kanina. So, ito na siya. X minus 3 squared over A squared is 9 minus Y minus 2 squared over B squared is, So, yung B squared natin ay 16 equals to 1. Okay, so ito na yung, so this is now the standard form equation of the hyperbola given the vertices and foci. Alright? So, pinaka-importante yung pag-identify nyo dito ng y and x coordinates. Okay? Y and x coordinate para alam nyo kung ano yung gagamitin ninyong form or standard form. Okay? Para mahanap yung standard form given the vertices and foci. Alright? So, that ends our discussion for our topic about hyperbola. So, if you have any questions regarding hyperbola, ayan, so magtanong lang kayo. Pwede nyo kong tawagan dun sa number na pinakita ko kanina at the beginning of our discussion. Right? So, for your activity, ito, solve what is being asked in each item, show your complete solution, and then circle your final answer. Alright? There. So, dapat alam nyo kung nasan yung x and y coordinates para alam nyo kung ano yung form na gagamitin. Okay? So, this is your requirements for week 9 for our topic, hyperbola. Alright? So, all you have to do is to identify the vertices and foci of the hyperbola with the following equations. So, I hope you understand our discussion for this week, and then see you again next week for our week 10. So, there. Thank you and have a nice day. Goodbye.